The story of a long desert journey and the search for survivors of the almost vanished and forgotten first people of Africa, the Bushmen. And although the journey was only made last year, and the search to which I've referred far back in my childhood, you see, I was born of an old South African pioneering family. I am of Dutch origin, and my people have been in Africa for over 300 years. In fact, my great-grandfather led the first trek out of the Cape of Good Hope into the interior. And my grandmother, her sister, and a wonderful Cape-colored servant they had were the only survivors of that journey. Oddly enough, in the trek following on behind, which rescued the children, came my grandfather, a young boy then. And he married my grandmother 18 years later. That is nearly 110 years ago. And soon after they married, they went to settle in one of the frontier districts of southern Africa. It was very, very wild country then. And significantly enough, my grandfather's farm, as he called it then, was named Bushmansfontein, which means Bushman Springs. I'm afraid you won't believe how wild the country was in my grandfather's day when you see the farm as it is now. I saw it only a few weeks ago, and it looked like this. It's just today an ordinary sort of South African farm, but in my grandfather's day, I assure you, it was wild, wild country, and in the heart of the ancient Bushman territory of southern Africa. Moreover, the Bushmen hadn't gone. The Bushman had only fled to the hills. He'd been driven out of the plains, but he was still in the hills. And rankling with injustice at what had been done to him, he came down from the hills whenever he could, whenever the backs of the invaders were turned, and he raided their farms and their homesteads. And of course they resented it very much. There was one thing that neither the black nor the white could forgive the Bushman, and that was that he had no sense of property, particularly not of theirs. And the result was that the invaders, particularly the white invaders, like my grandfather, organized themselves from time to time and went out to punish the Bushmen. You could almost see themselves saying to one another, "It's a lovely day today. Let us go out and shoot some Bushmen." Now that may sound very harsh, but if you read the history of what happened to the Bushmen, you'll come to very much that conclusion. And although my grandfather was a very religious man and was very upright and very honorable, and I loved him very much, but he had the same unforgiving attitude to the Bushmen. In fact, he organized the raid which killed off the last of the Bushmen in the southern Free State. I say killed off, but strictly that's not true. Because after the raid, when my grandfather was coming back from the cave in which the Bushmen had made their last stand, he heard some whimpering among the rocks. He went towards the sound, and there he found two little Bushman boys hiding. And it was more than even his stern old frontier heart could stand. And he took these two little boys up, he put them on front of his saddle, and he took them back to Bushman Springs, the place which had once belonged to the forefathers of these little Bushmen. And in my grandfather's home, these two little Bushman boys grew up as privileged members of the household. I remember them well, but when the time I was born, coming as I did at the tail end of a large Afrikaans family, they were already little old men. But you couldn't have had two more attractive companions. In fact, for a long period, long in my childhood time, they were my nurses. They looked after me. They went with me everywhere. And I remember they seemed to be as frightened of the dark as I was. And from them I learned something of their language. I learned to count up to 10 and nearly went purple in the process. I learned to say good day, and I learned to say good night in Bushman. That lovely good night of the Bushmen. And I went with them everywhere. They taught me what sort of food they gathered from the veldt. They taught me how to live if an emergency came, like themselves, entirely off the veldt. And they told me more. They told me the story, they told me the legends, and they told me the history as they knew it of their people. And in the process, I became so identified with them. I became to love them and their people so much that I felt that this extermination of their kind, I felt that this thing that my people and the black men had done to the Bushmen was so horrible that it might almost have been done to my own people. And ultimately, when these two little men died, I was heartbroken. And they died in a characteristic Bushman way. One little old man died of pneumonia, and the other died of a broken heart 10 days later, because he couldn't bear it to be alone. And when they were dead, I remember lying awake at night and feeling utterly, utterly miserable, because I thought that now there were no more Bushmen left in the world. I thought that now all these places, which once knew them so well, would know them no more. And I went on feeling that, and feeling utterly miserable, and feeling more and more ashamed of what we had done to the Bushmen, particularly when I started learning our history at school. And this went on for years, until one day an old hunter came into my father's home. We were still very much a frontier community, and all the great frontier characters used to call in at our house from time to time. And one day a very tall, tanned, lean, rugged sort of man walked in and said he'd come from a place I'd never heard of before, the Kalahari desert. And I remember my ears standing on end when suddenly I heard him say, "Do you know, I've just been in the Kalahari desert, and I've seen wild, wild Bushmen living there as they used to live in this part of the world." I remember going to my room, a wild surge of excitement and hope in me. I remember writing in the diary I'd just begun to keep in schoolboy Dutch. I wrote, and the day, I can see it so clearly, is the 13th of October, 1914. I wrote, "I have today decided that when I'm grown up, I'm going into the Kalahari desert and seek out the Bushmen and beg their pardon for what we have done to them." Now, what precisely had we done to them? Please come and look at this map with me. Now, 40,000 years ago, the whole of this area you see here, right from the Mediterranean down to the Cape of Good Hope, was inhabited by a man we all think was the ancestor of the Bushmen, a man called Paleolithic man, a caveman, a hunter. And 30 or 40,000 years ago, he was driven by an invasion from the east out of that area there into North Africa. And then in North Africa, he was driven down south of the Sahara, south of Egypt, into this part of Africa below the equator. But in this part of Africa, he maintained himself for about 30,000 years. He had the security and the isolation there to produce a culture of his own. This area here, was his favorite country. Here, at the southern tip of Africa, where the Antarctic swell breaks on the beaches of the Cape of Good Hope, the earliest sailors found the Bushmen combing the surf for food. Among these mountains and these fertile valleys, he had his home. Here, among these mountain tops, from these hillsides, he saw the white sails of the invaders come over the sea. In fact, remnants of the game he hunted have survived. The gnu, or wildebeest, as we call him, is still there. The blesbuck, called so because he has a white blaze in his forehead, is still running on the same slopes. The zebra and its young are still to be seen moving across the grassy meadows of Table Mountain and sheltering in its woods against the weather, as I saw them there a few weeks ago. They've survived because they've been protected by law. They're behind barbed wire. But the Bushman had no such protection, and you look for him in vain. Note, too, that among these animals there is one of the greatest buck of all Africa, the eland. He's not only the greatest in size, but he's the one who, above all the other animals, dominated the imagination of the Bushman. He's everywhere in Bushman painting. He is present in the Bushman stories and legends. But all these animals you see here, apart from the eland, the gnu, the zebra, and the blesbuck, were for thousands of years part of the Bushman's daily scene. And so on, from the far south across the fertile valleys of Good Hope, through the mountain passes, up, up, up into the interior of this wide country, all this was once Bushman land. In fact, this very area in its winter coat was so much the Bushman's that it's called Bushman land to this day. Where these tents stand, the Bushman was once a lord in his own right. These tents belong to a nomad people called Hottentots, and they are one branch of the invasion which drove the Bushman out of his country. This woman, this child, this cat, reckoned in Bushman time, are newcomers in this ancient land. Now you can go on in this way for 1,500 miles, due north, until you arrive among the Matopo Hills, without setting foot for 1 minute on anything that wasn't old Bushman land. Here you are, in the heart of what was for hundreds of years a great Bushman fortress. Here for centuries the Bushmen fought back against the invaders. And I find it ironical that the grave of one of the leaders of the victorious invasion, the grave of Cecil John Rhodes, is in its midst. The African guarding the grave is of the Matabele, who conquered the Bushmen, until he too was conquered by Rhodes in his turn. Hard by Rhodes's monument, there is another monument left behind by the Bushman to himself. You climb up the smooth slabs of rock to a cave 600 feet above the surrounding land. We ourselves find the few monuments of this kind left so precious that we protect them with barbed wire against the modern sightseeing vandal. And there you have everything that was dear to the Bushman. Water in the valley, a roof against the wind and weather, and smooth rock to paint on. No one knows quite how old these paintings are, and a moderate estimate puts them at 1,000 years. But faded as they are, you see distinctly a rhino, a giraffe, and other animals here. Compare these silhouettes with real animals who still stalk freely about in the vicinity. This young elephant bull, wondering whether he should charge us or not, was one of a herd of close on 1,000. This lion, going unperturbed through the bush, has been protected, but the Bushman has had no protection. And here too, in this far north, you meet again old friends of the Bushmen, great herds of the new, and once more the lordly eland. The eland is bigger here than in the far south. And look for the first time now with what immense gusto and precision the Bushman artist has painted a hunt of the eland. If you look closely here, you'll see a little Bushman hunter, his legs stretched out like an Olympic runner, closing in on an eland for the kill. Hard on this, you have a foretaste of how the Bushman saw the tall black invaders from the north before they provoked his animosity. Other scenes from his daily routine follow. A woman carrying a bundle of tubers on her head. A woman coming up to a friend resting in the shade with a gesture of affection. Another foreign giant, and a little Bushman standing gallantly up to him. A general scene in a Bushman encampment. A woman feeding her child. And then there's a Bushman hunter lying on his back, resting in the heat of the day, and others sitting around talking. Then a hunting scene, the hunter stooping to pick up his kill, and a frieze of men and women on the march, and once more a general scene round about a temporary camp. These scenes exhaust the selection in this particular cave, but in other caves nearby there are other samples of which these are representative. Here, for instance, is a Bushman's idea of an ostrich hunt. You can see a Bushman disguised as an ostrich creeping up on the right-hand side of the picture. Then there's a Bushman hunter setting out for the chase, surveying a tortoise, 2 ant bears, a litter of little ant bears, the inevitable gnu, and below the gnu, a magical python. There is also a herd of eland, done in the great period of eland painting, showing the herd pursued by a pride of lion, and one lion pouncing on the back of an eland. And last of all, there is the Bushman in a tender mood. You cannot fail to see the affection with which he has painted this conversation piece of an eland father and mother and their child. Now, I used to go all over South Africa looking at these rock paintings, and I never looked at them without this old, old sense of guilt being revived, because seeing the painting made me think of another story of my grandfather's. My grandfather told me that he took part in the raid which killed off the last of the Bushman painters in southern Africa. He was a very young man then, and they caught up with the Bushmen, and this painter was trying to escape on a horse. It's extraordinary how quickly the Bushmen learned to ride the horses of the invaders, and how well they rode them. And when this poor man was shot down, and my grandfather came up to the man's body, lying in the veldt, they found he had a zebra thong round his middle, and attached to this thong were a dozen little pots, and each pot contained a paint of different color. And that, alas, was the end of the last of this 1,000 and 1,000 years old school of painting in southern Africa. Now, there's one thing about Bushman painting which is rather remarkable. The Bushman who painted animals so well doesn't really give us an idea of what he himself looked like. And the trouble was that the Bushman was extraordinarily sensitive about his size. He was rather a small chap. He wasn't a pygmy. He was about 5 feet in height, as far as we can gather. But he felt that in comparison with this immense invasion that came from the north, that he was really a tiny little man. And as a result, he intended to exaggerate his own size in his painting. And it's rather an art telling when the giant in the painting is not just a Bushman and when he's a foreigner. In fact, the Bushman was so obsessed with this question of size that he'd like you to look upon him as a big chap, and the polite form of Bushman greeting, the way they greeted one another when they met, was to say, "Kaise kunkrenka," which meant, "I saw you looming up from afar, and I'm dying of hunger." Now, I'm going to show you in a minute or two how the Bushmen looked to my ancestors. But before I do that, I want you to realize what he truly looked like. And what he looked like on my grandfather's farm, because I had two authentic models always in front of my eyes. These two little Bushman children who survived my grandfather's raid. Now, they were perfectly shaped little men. Again, I emphasize they're not pygmies. They were about 5 feet in height and perfectly made. They had small feet, small hands, ankles like racehorses. But their little bodies were Cupid-shaped. They were well out in front and well out behind. And they had lovely peach-colored skins and deep, deep brown eyes with a wonderful slant to them, the same sort of slant you see in Mongol or Chinese eyes. And then they had a very loose, wrinkled skin. It was lovely to see them laugh, because this skin broke into 1,000 sort of cheerful little creases of all kinds. Now, when these little Bushmen died, and I thought that they'd gone forever, I used to go with my family to Cape Town, to the Cape of Good Hope. And I was taken to the museum there, and I was shown Bushmen behind the glass case in the museum. These were models made of live Bushmen who lived about 70 years ago. But they were models made of Bushmen in a decadent period, a few survivors who'd already been corrupted by the fat of civilization. Now, I would ask you, please, to remember that when you see them in these plaster casts in the museum in Cape Town, because, in fact, they were not really like that at their best. And also, please remember that the man who modeled them, the man who made these casts, typically had a rather disdainful attitude towards them. And what you are going to see now, in a sense, is a caricature. Here are some Bushman women with fat behinds when food was plentiful. They are followed by a group of Bushman hunters examining the spoor of an animal, and a hunter with a kill in his hand. There is an old lady making beads out of broken ostrich eggshells, and a Bushman housewife by her pot, the only utensil the Bushman had. Then please look at the pointed pan-like ears of this Bushman woman sitting here. Then there's an old lady sleeping on the ground, and a group of young women singing for a dance. Here, then, you have the final tragic irony. The Bushman survives in the Union of South Africa today only in the shape of these models behind glass in a museum. Now, you may wonder, as I do, when and where exactly this process of elimination began. Well, it seems to have been something that's been going on for close on 40,000 years. You'll remember that we left the Bushmen last time, driven out of the Mediterranean world, and driven well south of the Sahara and the plains of Upper Egypt. But in the southern half of the Africa, the Bushman maintained himself effectively for about 30,000 years. He didn't start getting seriously into trouble until the Arabs and other Orientals discovered what an extremely valuable source of supply for slaves Africa was. When that happened, the Arabs started raiding into the interior. And as they raided into the interior, the black Bantu races fled south. And as they fled south, being better armed than the Bushmen, with spears and shields and assegais, they drove the poor little Bushmen in front of them, fleeing south from one waterhole to the other. Unfortunately for the Bushman, when this process was absolutely at its most critical phase in the north, he was unfairly taken in the back. For about 300 years ago, my ancestors, the Dutch, landed at the Cape of Good Hope. And they'd not been at the Cape of Good Hope long when they found the Cape Peninsula much too small for them, and they started pushing north. And as they pushed north, they drove the Bushmen in front of them. And again, being better armed, they had it all their way. And they went on in this manner until suddenly the two waves of invasion, the European from the south and the African from the north, met. And in the process, the Bushman was squashed flat. And the only ones who remained were a few pathetic fragments who fled to the Kalahari desert. Now, the impact of this invasion is clearly shown in Bushman painting. At first, the Bushman painter was completely objective about the event. Now, here, for instance, is a Bushman painting of the invaders as he saw them. Now, here is another painting where the Bushman is still feeling sufficiently unthreatened to make fun of the black giants, but not for long, because more and more you begin to see this sort of painting, a painting of a battlefield with the dead scattered on the rocks and arrows flying thick and fast through the air. That is how it looked to the Bushman artist. We will now see how it appeared to the European historian. Here is a reconstruction of the black invasion from the north made for a historical occasion in South Africa recently. When that invasion started, everywhere the Bushman looked, he saw these giants pouring in onto him, and day and night the silence and the age-old peace around him were shattered by the sound of war drums and battle cries. Hard pushed in this manner in the north, the Bushman was about to be stabbed in the back. My ancestors landed at the Cape of Good Hope, looking oddly out of place and refined as they did so. Soon they found the Cape too small for them and started moving into the interior. Rifles in hand and singing their battle hymns, they too drove the Bushmen before them. Then inevitably, the two tides of invasion met. scene such as this, my great-grandparents were massacred, and only their daughters survived. When it was over, the Bushmen too had vanished from the scene into the great thirst land of southern Africa, the Kalahari. Now I've told you of this pledge, of this pact I made with myself when I was a child. Well, many years went by, and although I never forgot my pledge, I never got the chance to carry it out. But I was reminded of it in a manner very soon after the war, in a manner which I couldn't possibly ignore. I was sent by the British government on a mission to explore the Kalahari Desert. Now this is the Kalahari Desert. Would you please come and look at it a little more closely with me? Now this area here, the Kalahari Desert, is one of the great unknown quantities of Africa. That is, we know where it is, but we know very little about it. And I was sent by the British government to make a systematic exploration of the Kalahari Desert. And I can remember the relevant occasion extremely well. I remember coming one evening in the central Kalahari Desert here to a pan. Now, pan is an Afrikaans name for a dried-up depression in the Kalahari Desert. And I remember the sun was going down, and in this kind of rosy red light of the desert, we saw some human footprints in the dried-up clay. When I saw those footprints, I thought I felt exactly what Robinson Crusoe must have felt like when he saw the footprints of man Friday in the sands of his island. And all those people who were with me looked at the footprints, and they were all convinced that footprints so small, so far from water, could only have been made by the genuine Bushman. And those footprints became part of my conscience. They reminded me, in a way in which I couldn't ignore, of the fact that I had a 40-year-old pledge to fulfill. They reminded me of this pact I'd made in my childhood with the Bushmen. So when last year I got the opportunity, with the help of the BBC, of going to the Kalahari, I felt I just had to go. And next time I hope to take you with me on this journey, in search of a lost Bushman world, and to show you the people and the animals we met by the wayside. I hope to tell you of the spirits of the slippery hills, and to tell you of many other things, and show you many other places, until we made our final contact in the central desert at last. From their factory in Britain were there ready. Brian Curry from Kenya and Charles Leonard, a South African, our mechanic and recorder, were there to help me sort out our loads and supplies for 4 full months. Curry brought Cheruyot, a Kips Nagis from Kenya, as tracker and gun bearer. Dabe, my interpreter, a Bushman brought up in an Afrikaans oasis, was there, his wonderful old face creased in smiles. So was Jeremiah, a Barotsi, and my old safari cook, who bakes lovely bread in ant heaps. John Rautakal, a Bakwena from the southern Kalahari, came as my old camp help. John Imanovic, born in the Kalahari, an Afrikaner sort of Alan Quatermain, and an old friend. was there waiting for me. Duncan Abraham, a Scot from Zululand, was our cameraman. Brian Curry and Charles Leonard checked and rechecked the gear. It was good to see how thoroughly and in what an experienced way they did their task. In between, they, Johnny and I, worked out a route carefully along the edges of the rivers and the swamps of the far northern Kalahari land. On the morning of September the 3rd, we were ready to move off. We put our last personal gear into the trucks and set course for the bush. It seemed to me a good omen that it was almost 100 years to the day since Livingstone first discovered the falls, and that we were following for some hundreds of miles in his gallant footsteps. I stopped by his statue to have a last look at the mile of water plunging into the narrow abyss, and to watch the cool spray hanging in the morning air. Then I drove straight past the falls into the bush, humming to myself one of the trekker tunes invented for these occasions by my trekker forebears. For some days then, we followed close along the course of the Zambezi and the Chobe rivers. It's a very old part of Africa, that, and extremely interesting. It's full of game of all kinds. And after so many months in the towns of Europe and of Africa, I felt that I had truly come home at last. Heavy sand from my previous expedition 2 years before, and watched deserted woodcutter huts flash by. Or we would go through a flock of extremely nervous baboons, making for the trees with their youngsters lumping on their backs. Half a mile further on, we would see vultures wheeling in the sky. We'd stop our cars, get out, and see at once why the baboons were so nervous. A lion spoor, barely a minute old, was beside the track. At one place I followed the spoor 50 yards into the bush and found the vultures massing over what was left of a male baboon. We began to strike our first baobab trees, or cream of tartar trees, as my ancestors called them, because from the fruit which grows on this tree they made a rough baking powder for their bread and scones. These trees are always a great joy to me, because I associate them in my mind with the little Bushmen of my childhood. My grandfathers, a little old Bushman of whom I've told you earlier on, had a story about these trees. They say when the great Bushman spirit, the greatest of them all, Tung, was handing out plants and shrubs to all the human beings in the world to plant. He practically handed out all the plants when suddenly the evil one came along, in a great panic and a great rage. And the evil one said to the great spirit, Tung, he said, Kung, why are you always surprised that I behave so badly when you treat me so badly? Look what you've done. You've given all the spirits and all the human beings in the world trees to plant, and you've given me none. He put his case so well that the great spirit was extremely moved, and he handed out the last sapling he had to the evil one to plant. The evil one snatched it out of his hand, dashed off into the world, and planted it upside down. That was the baobab tree, and that's why it looks what it looks like. A week out from the falls, we had our first setback. We found our way to the northwest increasingly barred by water, 100 miles or more from where water normally is at that time of the year. The end of the day found us more and more ready for our rest. was always the last to go to bed and the first up in the morning. When we had water enough, we all shaved as quickly as we could. That is, all of us except Leonard, because he was allowed to grow a beard as a sort of calendar to mark the march of time for us in the bush. We ate our food, one of the only 2 meals we allowed ourselves in the day, and then tried to get moving before the sun got too hot. Early the next morning, I got my party ready to explore the hills. Samu Chao came to explain that his father had gone off alone in the hills to pray, but had told him to guide us to the sacred water. I thought at times I saw a look of reproach on some of those wrinkled old Bushman faces. Once, I left first. I think I left first because I felt rather upset. I was about to step into my car when I saw Daul Tre, as I'd seen her in the beginning. Saw her again in a sort of child-mother role, running up to make certain I had water enough for the journey. And from there on, the track went out over the dunes and on beyond to the great world from which we'd come, and the world which knew them not. Duncan, who stayed to film the end, said that Mu and his bride stood there, staring after us until my car vanished from sight. I told you last time of this journey of mine into the Kalahari desert, this desert in the heart of southern Africa. I told you of this journey of mine looking for the vanished people of southern Africa, the Bushmen. And I told you how my journey had taken me from the Victoria Falls here, all along the edges of these swamps, right round to a place called Mohembo on the Okavango River, and how we'd gone into the swamps for about 300 miles, and how, at a place called the place of the eddies in the swamps, we had found not the Bushmen of the veldt, not the hunters of the plain, but 3 river Bushmen. Now we gave them some presents and stayed with them for a while, recording their ways and their history. When we played back their recordings, they were so startled by the magic of it all that they replied again to our questions wherever they heard them on the tape. We left our river Bushmen thinking sadly that one day when they died, their like would never be seen again in the world. And we left them to start the next phase of our journey, a serious probe in the desert for the other great branch of the Bushman family, the veldt Bushman, the hunter of the plains. And we were starting our journey with a strange group of hills, the Tsodilo Hills, the hills you see here, a strange group of hills rising sheer out of the desert. And we had as a guide a man called Samuchoso. He told me then that these hills, the Tsodilo Hills, a Bushman name meaning the slippery hills, were the home of powerful spirits. On the main hill there was a sacred spring which never failed. Beside the spring, a tree with the fruit of good and evil on it, and nearby a rock with the knee marks where the Great Spirit had knelt on it to pray the day he made the world. In the caves and the rocks of the hills dwelt the spirits of all the great animals in the desert, and their hoof marks could be seen among the rocks. He told me that he had often done the hazardous journey to the hills to go and pray to the spirits for the welfare of his people, and he said that he would only come with me as a guide, provided I promised that none of us would shoot or kill any animal or even insect on the way, because it was an immutable law of the spirits that no man was allowed to come to them with blood on his hands. I agreed readily enough at the time that there would be no killing, and Samuchozo said he would come. But on the morning we set out for the hills, he told me that he was feeling very weak. He begged me to go to a place nearby in the swamps and to fetch his son to come and help him. Johnny and I set off in my field car to do so. We hadn't gone far when we met a Bushman in a clearing. He put on trousers for the traders he was visiting on the river. But he was pure Bushman for all that, and excited us by saying he'd met a party of Bushmen on their way to the slippery hills, only a moon before. Soon after, we came to the old prophet's son, Samuchow. Samuchow was sitting outside his hut, mending his fishing baskets in the heat of the day. It was characteristic of this spontaneous river people that when I told him his father wanted him, he asked no questions. He just stood up, said goodbye quite casually to his wife and children, and climbed into my vehicle with me. I rejoined my main party late that evening, camped deep in the bush, about 25 miles on the way to the slippery hills. And I cannot to this day understand why I didn't tell my party there and then that I'd promised Samuchozo there would be no shooting. I can only explain it by saying that I was extremely tired, that I'd been on the road for weeks, and I'd worked very hard. But somehow my promise slipped my memory, and I forgot it the next morning. Early the next morning, I sent Johnny and Brian Curry on ahead. I came behind in another truck with Duncan Abraham filming. We hadn't been on the road 1 hour when I heard ahead of me, just like that, 2 shots ring out, and my heart sank. I realized at once what I'd done. But for the moment, with the sort of facile optimism one has on those occasions, I said to myself, oh, they've probably missed. Well, I reckon without my Brian and without my Johnny. We caught up with them, and the first thing I saw was Brian and Johnny looking at a warthog. And I saw Samuchozo standing nearby, and I shall never, never forget the look on his face. I went up to him at once, and I said, Samuchozo, I'm sorry. It's all my fault. I forgot to tell them. He accepted my apology gracefully, but in a way which intimated that it was hardly for him to accept at all. I've never seen a warthog look more a thing of evil, and I was glad to try and forget it in the task of finding our way through the heavy sand and scrub. But all went well. All went well, that is, for a while. Now, the Tsodilo Hills are perhaps not much as hills would go in true hill country, but after 6 weeks in flat, sandy country, they made a curious, almost supernatural impression on our eyes. Master Jeremiah said to me, with a note of awe in his voice, they like the rocks Moses hit in the desert to get water for the Israelites. Jeremiah had hardly spoken when for the first time my car engine failed. All the while I found, comparing notes later, we were all becoming more and more uneasy about the slippery hills as they came nearer and nearer to us. They rose so sheer and so silent on an empty world of sand and bush, and they were the only ones of their kind for hundreds of miles around. We should have been among those hills in the afternoon, but we didn't get to camp until the sun went down. Round our fire that night, I found my own uneasiness growing and looked about me. I thought the same was true of my companions. Instinctively, I repeated my apology of regret to Samuchozo for the shooting. Again, he nodded gracefully, but intimated that it didn't concern him so much as whatever presided over those strange hills in the night beyond our flickering fire. Early the next morning, I got my party ready to explore the hills. Samu Chow came to explain that his father had gone off alone in the hills to pray, but had told him to guide us to the sacred water. Then we forced our way through immensely thick thorn bush along the base of the hills. The strange cliffs seemed to look down silently and disapprovingly upon us, and we were amazed to see the tamest animals we had yet met, no doubt because they were herded by a spirit of the hills. I forbade Brian or Johnny, who were greatly tempted, even to aim their guns at any of the animals. A mile from camp, Samu Chow picked up human spoor and beckoned us to follow quickly. Alas, we were too late. The spoor was at least a month old. What made it sadder, it was without doubt the spoor of true felt Bushmen. The traces were unmistakable. There were the characteristic heaps of cracked and empty Kalahari nutshells. There were the giraffe knuckle bones, which the Bushmen loved so much for their delicious marrow. There was a discarded Bushman harp, which Samu Chow fingered lovingly. There was a leather Bushman bag with ostrich egg beads attached to the strap. And finally, there was a typical Bushman shelter. No doubt Bushmen had been living there for many weeks. Half an hour's climb from there brought us to the last rocky ledge of the summit. And close by, Samu Chow showed us the marks in the rock where the Great Spirit had first knelt in prayer, and he himself got down on his knees to show us how the Spirit had prayed. He pointed out to us the magic spoor in the rock, something which could not be explained by wind or water, but was clearly the hoof mark of an antelope. And then we came to the pool of sacred water. Close by lay a wooden scoop discarded by the Bushmen. We took it down to the water, and with it filled our flasks against the thirsty afternoon. Just beyond the pool, we came at last to the tree of good and evil, just as Samu Chow had foretold. Well, you may have noticed how short that last shot was. Well, I must tell you that all that day we've been having intense camera trouble. Magazine after magazine jammed, and Duncan Abrams said that in all his 6 years of experience as a cameraman, he'd never seen the like of it before. We went back to camp that night, and there we had another disappointment. The hyenas were howling all round our camp, as Samu Chow said, like the spirits of departed men. We tried to record them. Our brand new recording machine, which had behaved so admirably up to now, failed us. We failed to repair it. Duncan Abraham worked until late that night, putting his magazines right. At the end of it he said, well, I'll show those spirits tomorrow. But I couldn't help thinking he was being unduly provocative, particularly when I saw the way Samu Chow looked at him. Soon after sunrise, we returned to the hills. The rocks on this morning looked to me more forbidding than ever before. Somehow I was not in the least bit surprised when very soon after we began filming them, to hear Duncan Abraham swearing in the most uninhibited fashion. His camera had failed again, and the frames were slipping in on one another, as you can see them here. We made a laborious repair and adjustment, and then filmed our first rock paintings at the base of the main hills. An immense frieze, this, about 90 feet long and 17 feet high, and once upon a time covered with a crowded pageant of flame-like animal life. Now, however, it was faded, yet still showed clearly some giraffe, some hartebeest, a tortoise, a baboon and rhinoceros, which strangely enough no longer exists in the Kalahari. We sat there in the shade, making tracings of the drawings, and had more camera trouble. That repaired, we started up the cliff. Samut Chow insisted on leading the way. I followed with Charles and Duncan behind. Again, it was 120 in the shade. And what was worse, our hoodoo, as you'll notice from the film, followed us all the way to the top. Our camera kept on slipping. Looking back, I think we're lucky our feet didn't slip as well. But once on top, we held our breath. Far below us, the endless Kalahari bush stretched away for more than 100 miles, and there wasn't a wisp of smoke or dust to trouble the peace of the view. And over this view there curved a slab of smooth, honey-colored stone. And from this slab there looked down on us a lovely giraffe and a majestic eland bull, painted in bright vermilion, a truly magical sight. Below the eland were some rhino, but what moved me most was that the forgotten Bushman artist had daubed his little hands in his own paint and pressed them there as a sort of signature to his great work. Clearly this ledge, an overhanging rock, was all that was left of what had once been an immense cave, and we accordingly believed those paintings to have been some thousands of years old. We wanted to go on filming, but here our camera broke down for the last time that day. We repaired them again, and as we did so, Samuchozo asked me, "Would you like me, master, to find out what is wrong?" He took out a needle and stared at it, saying, "Master, the spirits are angry, because you've come to them with blood on your hands. They're so angry that if they didn't know that your heart was pure, they would have destroyed you all. As it is, they've decided to punish you by punishing your machines." As he spoke, our cameras jammed again. I began to fear our admirable field cars would be failing us next. But that night I had an idea. I said to Samuchozo, "Samuchozo, suppose I were to write a letter to the spirits begging their pardon. And suppose we were to put it in a bottle and take it up to the hills and bury it at the foot of the great eland for them to fetch and to read and take away. Do you think that would help?" Well, then, he said, "I think it's a very good idea." I sat down there and then and wrote the letter of which you see a copy here. We humbly beg the pardon of the great spirits of these slippery hills, and for any disrespect we may have shown them, and for any disturbance we may have caused in their ancient resting place. We bury this letter at the foot of this painting, which is so clearly evidence of their power to move flesh and blood to create beyond itself. And we implored them, those who come after us, to reflect on this letter and to show the spirits greater respect than we have done. We buried it at the foot of the great eland at dawn next day, and as I looked out over that immense Kalahari view for the last time, I found myself deeply moved. "Samuchozo," I said, "do you think all is well now?" He took out his old needle, threaded it again, and put it in his palm. And he stood there with that lovely dawn light expanding and breaking over the hills. And he said after a while, "Master, all is well. But the spirits asked me to say that when you come to this place you're going to mend your machines, you will find some more unhappiness waiting for you. But you must not be anxious, because it's an unhappiness that belongs to the past, and not to today or tomorrow." We left the slippery hills then, and we came right the way round here to a small police outpost there. And when we got there, we found a telegram waiting for Charles Leonard, saying that his father had died a month before, and that he was wanted at home. And from there, I did a 1,000-mile journey out to Johannesburg to repair our machines, and I came back to this place again. And when I got back there, we started on our journey for the Central Desert. And it was as if we had moved into quite another dimension of living, because where things had gone so much against us before, it now seemed that nothing could go wrong with us anymore. Then, my back to the great waters of the north. We had a last nostalgic look at Lake Nagami, and then pushed on deeper into the desert, passing skeleton after skeleton, to remind us of the great thirst ahead. We followed tracks I'd made nearly 3 years before with heavier vehicles, and so unvisited is the central desert that the tracks were still perfectly legible. We began to meet one of the main features of the central desert, those strange, shimmering depressions the old Kalahari hands call pans. Beyond the pans we entered a hard world of steel-like thorn, which clutched at our vehicles and left long scars in the process. Nonetheless, these bushes are home to me, and I find their unending variety of shapes and outlines against the blue sky a constant delight to look on. We moved on like this for a week, crossing thorn and pan after pan in this way. Each pan seemed to have its own ostrich in charge. It got hotter. The slight cloud in the sky only stressed the blueness and the emptiness of it all. We pressed on till we came to our last oasis, seeking water and news of Bushmen. It's an amazing place, this oasis. It maintains some hundreds of people of a mixed race called Kalahari. It possessed only a couple of wells like these to supply these people and their cattle. The wells are busy from dawn to dusk, and yet the cattle and the people look surprisingly well on the water. One reason why these people manage so well in their harsh desert surrounding is because they have a strong mixture of Bushman blood, as you can see in their faces. You'll notice how many of these women, for instance, in different clothing and in a different setting might pass for Mongols, always a true sign of ancient Bushman blood. Look at the slanted eyes and the pointed ears of these women. We reached this oasis just as the camel patrol of the small, purely African force who manned the remote outpost was setting out on desert patrol. The men told me the sergeant in charge was still at their base, and I hastened to call on him. He's an old friend for whom I have the deepest respect. Although he sees European superiors only once a year, he runs his little station with great circumspection. He sees, for instance, that the flag is struck every evening at sunset, and that it is hoisted every morning at sunrise with the appropriate ritual. I've arrived at this outpost for many years at all sorts of unexpected hours and never found the ritual wanting. Always his sense of order is beyond praise. It's a sort of order human beings produce only when they truly love the value behind the exterior. We saw the flag raised next morning and then set off again. The day was like steel, and by noon the temperature was back at 120. We were forced to rest ourselves and our vehicles for a while, and it was amazing how easily everyone flopped out in the nearest shade. My sergeant had warned me that most of the people in the central desert were already on the way out, driven out by the lack of water and hunger. We were startled to hear loud shouts break in on our rest that afternoon. Crossing the edge of the pan, nearby, a group of people came running towards our vehicles. They were some mongrel bushmen on their way to the police post and desperate with thirst. We knew at once what they were coming for and uncovered our water tanks to help them. We filled some cans with fresh water and poured it out into a cracked enamel bowl which they held out to us. You can see how thirsty they were from the way the youngsters went on drinking at the leak, while the grown-ups drank on top. One old lady who could hardly stop drinking said that the water running out of one of our tanks was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen in her life. While she drank, another satisfied old lady sat in the shade nearby, digging out cool sand to throw over herself, just as elephants do to keep cool. We went deeper south, and we cast round here in this central part of the Kalahari. All the time it got hotter and it got drier, but we found no Bushmen. Until one day I thought we were really going to strike it lucky. We were just here when I heard Dabe one afternoon giving a great shout. And then in the distance we saw a party of people coming through the scrub and the sand towards us. They looked the authentic Bushmen. Our excitement was intense. But alas, when they came nearer, although we realized that they were the nearest thing to the felt Bushmen we'd yet struck, they were not what we sought. Firstly, they had to be suspect because they were on their way out to some outpost for relief. They were dazed by the sun and lack of food and water. We were all deeply moved by their emaciated bodies and sunken faces. But also clearly, they were too tall and lanky for the true Bushman kind. Some of the women may have been pure Bushmen, particularly this newly married girl with the ritual marks still fresh on her cheeks. So, her friend with that truly Chinese face. But we quickly realized that they'd been spoilt for our purpose by years of contact with civilization. We gave them all the water we could, and we had an inkling of the hardships they suffered by watching a mother squeeze the juices of some desert potato into the dry throat of a little boy. They told us that for a month they'd been living on nothing but the juice of this wild potato to drink. We felt so sorry for them that we made our camp for the night with them and made Jeremiah cook them the biggest meal we could afford. It was a happy night that, listening to them singing once more with their tummies full. And in the early morning, while some of the members of our expedition were still in bed, Dabe and I got them ready for our recording microphones. There was no longer an evil spell on our recording machine, and for 2 hours in the cool of the morning, we recorded their music. As a parting present, they gave us some news. About 5 days' march to the northeast, they said, there was a party of true wild Bushmen left. The wild Bushmen were grouped round one of the few sip wells in the central Kalahari desert. 2 days later, Johnny came back from a hunt, accompanied by an old man, also on his way out of the hot desert. This old man confirmed the news. He told us that those fabulous sip wells were only 2 days' march northeast of us. He was accompanied by a group of the most enchanting children with true little Bushman faces. He called them out of the bush and with his wife paraded them one by one for us. Then we pushed on as fast as we could along an old police patrol track. "50 miles beyond, we came to one of the great sand dunes which line the deep, dry watercourse in the desert. We struggled up through the bush and sand to the top of the dune. We looked down on an immense stretch of country in which the Sipwells were said to be situated. Again, I was surprised to see my old tracks from 3 years before crossing my line of vision. I climbed on the roof of my car. I stood there with a hot wind blowing straight in my face. I looked and looked and looked down into the bottom of the dry river bed. Something had appeared to be moving. I called Dabe, who has the eyes of an eagle. He only had to stand on the bonnet and give one glance before saying, "Master, a wild, wild man in the grass down there." We hurried on down the sides of the dune as quietly as we could go. Even so, we wouldn't have been silent enough if it hadn't been for the wind blowing from the wild, wild man straight to us, and for the sun shining straight into the wild, wild man's eyes. 100 yards from the place where the wild man was, we stopped. We jumped out. We pushed Dabe forward, still afraid the wild man might run. Dabe stepped out, hat in hand, and called out the politest Bushman greeting, saying, "Sham Kankay, good day. I saw you from afar, and I'm dying of hunger." At the sound, the wild creature flew up and came at us. Dabe called out again. At that, all the fear went out of the stranger. He stuck his spear into the sand and came forward, as you'll see him here, shy and friendly, to find out what sort of people we were. We'd made our contact at last. We come now to the moment when our relationship with the Bushmen in the central Kalahari desert was really full and complete. We had been living with them for many weeks. We had shared a great many experiences with them. We'd been hunting with them, we'd been hungry with them, we'd been thirsty with them. And now we had danced with them. And we had shared perhaps one of the greatest experiences of all, the coming of the rains in the central desert. Now, this question of rain may sound very dreary to people in Europe and America. But I can assure you there's nothing more wonderful than to see the rains breaking in a place like the Kalahari Desert. There it's a matter of life and death. And the Bushmen, who are so very much children of nature, who are so close to it and so much part of it, they feel the question of the rain so much that when it doesn't rain, the women go sterile and bear no children. So when these rains broke, that night, after a great dance, the reaction was wonderful. The reaction of the earth, the plants, the animals, and the Bushmen was in a sense a reaction to a miracle. And we noticed all sorts of changes in the Bushmen. One of the first things I noticed, and a thing I shall forever associate in my mind with the coming of the rains in that central desert, is a new song which they suddenly started singing round about us. I would just like to play that song for you because it is very moving and fits the occasion so beautifully. The earth cried under the sun, "I'm dry." My heart cried by the fire, "I'm alone." The wind came and said, "The rain is coming." The grass said, "A hunter is near." Yes, truly, the rain is near. Oh, listen, a hunter is here. It rained for 2 days, and I sat in my camp, this tune constantly going through my head. When at last the sun broke through the clouds, it shone on a world transformed. It was astonishing how the stricken desert burst into life. The branches of the thorn trees seemed lit with bright buds overnight. The desert May flashed like snow against a blue sky. Wild begonias, sweet honeysuckle, pink, purple, and yellow convolvulus bloomed all around us. more and more May came out. Petunia, desert pride. The stainless amaryllis of classical Greek purity shone underneath silver nets of the awakened cocoons. The wild protolaria, the flowering thistle, the delicately carved bohinia, suddenly shone like stars in the grass and against the blood-red sand. The honey bees, brought to life, crowded around our camp and raided our water bags. Beetles we'd not seen before came out to burrow. Centipedes started traveling and exploring. The chameleon, who is loathed by all Bushmen because they say he brought the first news of death from the moon to the world, found it paid once more to emerge and fish for insects in the sun. The tortoises began to hatch their young, and the birds to sing in a way they'd not sung before. And the birds started rebuilding their nests. We had several great nests of the fabulous community birds near the sip wells. Their noise night and morning was deafening. A hawk hung overhead all day long, trying to catch them coming in and out of their common nest. But they were always too much on the alert and knew when the hawk was furthest away. They'd emerge all together then, like waves of smoke. The great process of renewal was evident everywhere. The larger animals began to bear their young. In a deep hole nearby, we watched a baby hyena, one of the shyest twilight animals in the world, getting bigger. We helped it along with morsels of our own food. And close by, the cub of a fox one day flashed by one of our cameras. Then, most pathetic of all, in a patch of scarlet lilies one morning, we found a baby springbuck. It was bleating like a child for its mother, because the mother appeared to have been killed by a lion. So Moo told us, after examining the spoor. Moo said, it was a lion which prowled nightly round the sip wells. Every morning in the distance, we'd see the ostriches doing their mating dance. Soon our hunters, Moo, Moo, and Bulb Moo, were coming back with ostrich eggs in their satchels. They told us that everywhere the birds had begun to lay. And then one day, Dabe and I, out hunting, too saw a glint of white in the distance, and we knew at once what it was. One of the curious things about the ostrich is that she lays her eggs always in an open space. She does that because she wants to make quite certain that there's nothing creeping up behind her to destroy her. The ostrich can protect herself very easily against hyena, jackal, and the lesser carnivorous animals, but she cannot do that against the lion and the leopard, although she has a tremendous kick in that long, stringy leg of hers. Those talons of the ostrich are extremely dangerous. Now, as we walked towards this nest, Dabe and I noticed a very curious thing about it. We saw something that has always intrigued me about ostrich egg nests. There was one egg lying well outside the nest. Well, Muren, Dabe said, you must know the reason then. This bird is so weak in the head that it needs the egg outside the nest to remind it of what it's doing when it's sitting on the other eggs to hatch them. If that egg weren't outside, the bird's head is so weak it would forget why it's sitting there and it would just get up and walk away. Daily, this sort of spring fever that was about in the plants and the animals seemed to invade our bushmen, to go deeper and deeper into them. A kind of restlessness came all over them. Our hunters would go out in the morning and sometimes stay away for a day or two even. things they'd never done before. And I began to realize that they were really spying out the land to see if the moment hadn't come when they could set out again on one of their great walkabouts, the thing that they really live for and love above everything else. And the change seemed to me greatest of all in mu and kokam, lips of finest fat. I would pass them and I would hear them humming this new tune which I heard with the breaking of the rains. And they would be looking at each other in a way which I hadn't quite noticed before, although I'd had my suspicions. And I said to Dabe one day, I said, Dabe, now, if a Bushman falls in love, how can you tell that he is really in love? And he sort of scratched his old Bushman head and he said, Moren, you know, he said, they start doing things they've never done before. I said, what sort of things, Dabe? He said, well, Moren, they begin to notice things you've not seen them noticing before. Dabe's words came back to me when I saw the women prepare the ground one day around their shelters for one of their favorite games. For this game they use a tsama, melon, as a ball. They throw it to one another on the run in a sort of game of rounders, singing as they do so. We went out into the desert to look for melons, and on the way what do you think we saw? We saw a blue wildebeest, but the blue wildebeest just flicked his heels at us and ran away. We went deeper into the desert, and what did we see? We saw a hartebeest and called out, "Oh, hartebeest, come to us." But it just flicked its heels and ran away. Then we saw a gemsbok, and we cried, "Oh, gemsbok, come to us, because we're hungry." But it just flicked its heels and ran away. When the game got to this point, I suddenly saw what Dabe meant about Bushmen in love. Because there was Mu at the unmanly pastime of watching the women play. And we all thought we knew whom he was watching. There was another sure sign that something was up. Dabe said, "You'll see in the morning when the sun is not yet high, such a man will call on the women when they're getting up and even light their fire for them." Dabe said, "And if the woman gives him her water shell to drink from, you can be fairly certain there is something between them. As certain as this old lady appeared to be." And what is stranger still, Dabe said, is that such a man will begin to notice things he's never noticed before. He'll even stop on his way to look at flowers. I must confess, too, that when Mu came into camp to play for us and to listen to our recordings of Bushman music, he seemed to me now preoccupied in a way in which he had never been before. Then Duncan came back one morning and said he just had a lovely wind-swept glimpse of Courtship, our beauty. He said he'd seen her very pensive and without headdress, staring at the flowering amaryllis near the sipwells. Not long after filming in the Bushman camp with Duncan and Dabe, I saw something that made me think. Mu suddenly appeared at the shelter of Courtship. He had a satchel full of something, and he looked very mysterious in the process. When he suddenly went and sat beside Courtship to pour out a heap of one of the greatest Bushman delicacies, the rare marama nut, Dabe whistled. "Moren, master, he's been at it for days." When Courtship broke one nut in half and gave the first nut to Mu, Dabe turned to me and said, "Moren, now the fat's in the fire." When I saw Mu some days later cleaning a Hemsbach head, my last doubts vanished. The next thing Dabe said to me is, "Moren, such a fellow will be making a bow next." Now here we come to one of the most interesting things about the life of the Bushman. I've heard all my life of the existence of a Cupid's bow, of course, as you have. But I've never seen it as a living part of a living society. Now, the Bushman actually uses a love bow in his courtship. When a Bushman falls in love, he takes the horn of a buck, which you've just seen, he makes a little bow out of it. A little bow like this, which is a bow that Nu made for me. And he makes a little quiver and fills it with tiny little arrows. And then when he's ready, he takes an arrow, fits it to his bow, rather like this, and then he stalks his lady love. And his proposal consists of aiming this little bow at his lady love and shooting it into her, like that. Now, I want to emphasize one thing about this to you, and that is that the Bushman feels very deeply about this love bow business. It's part of his religion. And in getting Mu and Courtship, our beauty, to act out the love bow ritual sequence for us, they did so very reluctantly. It was a great act of trust on their part, and any restraint in their movements and actions is due entirely to that. Our first intimation that the bow was ready was when Mu drew me aside one morning and asked if I would meet him alone in the desert. We heard him coming a long way off. He was playing his string instrument as he came towards us, in a glade bursting into flower, and there for the first time I saw the Bushman's Cupid's bow. As for the woman, Darby said, Moran, she'll be sitting by herself and singing to herself. And she'll be forced almost to help to go out and look for the food. The man, meanwhile, Darby said, will make certain no one will know what he's been doing and where. That done, he'll make for a place where he knows his woman is going to be. He'll see the woman coming, and unseen, will creep close to her. Then he'll shoot his arrow at her. If he hits her, Darby continued, and provided she doesn't throw the arrow away, then you'll see a thing or two. We then saw Mu in the distance, walking to a spot where Lips of Fat, returning, couldn't fail to see him. Wait, Moran, Darby said. You'll now see how his food has been prepared for him. The arrow was unbroken. Moran, Darby said, she is his. We saw Mu suddenly respond in the way Bushmen for thousands of years have responded in this situation. His arms went up, and, like an eagle, he went after her. A fortnight later, this drama came to the end of its beginning. Mu had the blanket of buckskin ready as the final ritual demanded, and draped it round her before us all one morning. As Darby had put it, from then on, she was his. My own little drama, this 40-year-old drama of mine, too, was coming to an end. Daily I noticed our Bushmen were getting more and more restless. I realized that it would be cruel to hold them back much longer from their longed-for walkabout into the great desert. They looked at me in sort of way as if to say, aren't you coming along as well? Of course, and alas, I couldn't do it. So I told my people, pack up, get ready, because we too must move on. The children watched the last preparations with the look one sees in the eyes of the inarticulate when their home is breaking up for a journey. To distract them, I made Dulce, scent of gazelle, and her brothers help me pack. On the final morning, at grey daybreak, the older ones were in our camp. The fire, and their eyes followed us from one end of the They shivered by the grating camp to the other. Charles, Johnny, and I felt miserable to pull down what had been our home for so long in the desert. I thought at times I saw a look of reproach on some of those wrinkled old Bushman faces. They didn't seem to understand really why it was at all necessary for us to go when we'd all been such good friends. Music. Mu and his bride seemed forced to console themselves, as always in the past, with some of their beloved. For once, I left first. I think I left first because I felt rather upset. I was about to step into my car when I saw Dulce, as I'd seen her in the beginning. Saw her again in a sort of child-mother role, running up to make certain I had water enough for the journey. My last view of them all was of them standing by the side of the track we'd made to the Sipwells. And from there on, the track went out over the dunes and on beyond to the great world from which we'd come, and the world which knew them not. Duncan, who stayed to film the end, said that Moo and his bride stood there, staring after us until my car vanished from sight. All that day, I was oppressed by one thought. In those last days of the Sipwells, I wanted to give the Bushmen a present, and I found it almost impossible to give them one. I realized that I had nothing to give which in some way wouldn't add to the litter of their little lives and make life more difficult for them. And I realized now on the way out there was only one way which was really giving to the Bushmen at all, and that was the way of giving them a place in our hearts and imaginations, and consequently a place in our planning for the future. And that is so urgent and so necessary because this process of elimination I've been describing to you, this 40,000-year-old process of elimination is still going on in the Kalahari Desert. Make no mistake about that. We've stolen all the Bushmen's best water, the black man and the yellow man and the white man. And the Bushman is still threatened. And what is more, is administered by people who do not really care and who do not understand. Do you know that in the whole of the administration, which administers that great desert territory in your name and mine, there's not one man who speaks Bushman. There's not one man who really knows what they think and what they feel. Do you realize that the game in the Kalahari Desert is protected and the Bushman is punished for hunting and killing the game, although he needs it for survival? And he who owned all that country, who was the lord of it all once, he has no such protection at all. He has no special rights of any kind. And this thought darkened my whole morning on that way out from the Sipwells. On the way back, along the fringes of the desert, I saw signs of how this process of elimination by disintegration among the Bushmen was going on. I kept on coming across fragments of what had also once been happy Bushman communities, like the one I had just left behind. Gone now, and gone were the frank, unashamed, with the self-reliant, sturdy, manly people like Moo, Bao Tao, and Moo, and gone were the frank, unashamed women like Mukam and Gao Tse and her friends. I saw instead sordid, demoralized people in the grip of a disdainful rag and tatter contamination with our own civilization. I saw them doing work for a people who didn't understand them and didn't know their beginnings. I saw them as convicts in convicts' clothes, punished for laws they didn't make in a language they couldn't understand. I found one oasis even, with a jail to compel the Bushmen to live in a way which was not only not their own, but also a kind of death to them. I saw the deadly marks of our own incomprehension and lack of imagination in so many things like these by the side of the long trail out and along the edges of the desert. I could not accept that this look we've imposed on those faces is the best that we can do. I could not accept that that reproach which was in those eyes should remain there forever. If what I've told you and what you've seen in these films can help you to bring back some hope to those despairing Bushman faces, the child in me who pledged the man to the journey, and the man himself, will be more than content. And in that hope, I wish you the ancient Bushman farewell. Kai Se Kum. And I leave with you these few happy pictures of the Bushman as he still is in the central Kalahari, and with your help can go on remaining indefinitely.